Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Welcome, everyone, to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. We are coming near to the end of the series. Last time we looked at Sherman's march to the sea. We saw the fall of Atlanta, where the South and its infrastructure and its industrial base and its entire ability to support the war is being destroyed. Sherman then swings up north. He goes through Savannah up to the Carolinas. But we left Grant. Where is Grant now? And is the war truly over? Lincoln has been reelected, but Grant now has to contend with his greatest foe, Robert E. Lee. We're going to see what happens with the Overland campaign and the eventual end of the war. All right, we have a lot of territory to cover, much like the Union Army, so we're going to feel them in a sense as we march through quite a bit on our own right. So James, let's start up. What is Grant's plan for ending the war? A little bit of review might be in order.
Yeah, let's back up to actually before the election and see what, like you said, what Grant's plan is and what at least on paper, what the Union is supposed to do. So Grant was brought over in March of 1864, and he was made a three-star general, as we mentioned, the only one in the Union Army. That's a lieutenant general, and he was only the second person to achieve a full rank of lieutenant general since George Washington. In other words, I don't know if I said that correctly, but George Washington had the rank, and now Grant's only the second person to have that rank.
Right.
And he's also now general-in-chief of the entire Union Army, so he is in charge not just of the Eastern armies, but of everything. And we did touch on this, but let's review again. It doesn't hurt to go back over what Grant is planning for the entire Union Army, East and West. He comes up with a five-part strategy. First of all, he wants General Nathaniel Banks, who is out in Louisiana, commanding a relatively small force, not tiny, but much smaller than what Grant has and what Sherman has. Banks, his job is to march on Mobile. Mobile, Alabama was the last Confederate port on the Gulf of Mexico that was had not been taken. He's supposed to take the city, then move eastward toward Georgia, and there were no significant Confederate forces in the area. So he probably wasn't going to have a whole lot of opposition. So that's part one. Part two is for Sherman to march toward take Atlanta. He had Joseph Johnston in his way, but as we saw in a previous episode, Johnston was fired and replaced by General Hood. And General Hood, is, as an old TA of mine used to say, Sherman didn't take Atlanta, Hood just lost it. So Hood was a disastrous choice to command an army in the Confederacy or anywhere, I guess. But we saw how Sherman did successfully take Atlanta and then march to the sea. So that part works. Part C, or part three, the Army of the Potomac is going to attack Lee's army, forcing him back toward Richmond and preventing him from reinforcing Joseph Johnston. Part four is that our old friend Benjamin Butler, he's like the Forrest Gump of the Civil War. He just pops up everywhere. There's several people like that we've seen. Johnston is another one, but Butler now is in command of an army on the peninsula of Virginia, and his job, it's called the Army of the James, after the river, and his job is to march up towards Richmond from the southeast and put pressure on the city so that Lee would be attacked on two sides. And then another general named Franz Sigel, a German-American, he had an army of 6,500 in West Virginia. And I don't know if I ever mentioned this, but West Virginia breaks away from Virginia and becomes a separate state, officially gained statehood in 1863. Just interesting fun fact. It doesn't really affect the military situation that much, but it's not part of the Confederacy. So Sigel's job is to march into the Shenandoah Valley, which we've talked about several times before, and we'll talk about it again. Very important part of the Confederacy and of Virginia. It's considered the breadbasket of Virginia. His job is to commandeer the resources there and disrupt communications with the Valley and Lee's army. And when Lincoln was asked, why are you putting these two generals, which everybody knew they weren't really great generals, why are you having them do this? What's the point of their actions? And Lincoln said, those not skinning can hold a leg. So, so Grant is the one doing the skinning, and the other two are going to hold the leg, which is Robert E. Lee's army. All right, so how did all that go? Well, first of all, Banks never even launched the attack on Mobile. Instead, he moved up the Red River in an attempt to invade Texas, and this effort fails, as do pretty much all efforts to invade Texas. We did talk about this before, and this was not Banks's fault. It was actually Lincoln and General Halleck that told him to go take Texas instead of going to Mobile. But anyway, complete failure there. Now we'll talk about Butler and Sigel. We did not talk about what happened to them. Butler moved extremely slowly up the Virginia Peninsula, just plodding along, another great Union Army tradition. And Butler moved so slowly that the Confederates were able to put together an army of 18,000 under Beauregard. That's another one of these Forrest Gump kind of people. He's just everywhere. We've seen him east, west, north, south. Well, not north, but south. Anyway, so Beauregard's army defeats Butler at the Battle of Drury's Bluff, a fairly minor battle on May 15th, 1864. Butler entrenched, and Beauregard did likewise. And that's it. So basically, they're just going to sit there the rest of the time. Grant later said that Butler's army was as completely shut off from further operations directly against Richmond as if it had been a bottle strongly corked. So good old Butler does what he does best. He blows it, and he's corked up pretty much. Beauregard is able to send reinforcements to Lee. And then in the valley, the Shenandoah Valley, Sigel was opposed by an army under John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge has been in command for most of the war, different armies, different places. Fun fact, he was the vice president in the United States under Buchanan. Yes, Breckinridge was vice president from 1857 to 1861, and he had run for president. He was the Southern Democratic candidate in 1860, but of course lost and then threw in his lot with the Confederacy. Anyway, the two forces clashed on May 15th at the Battle of New Market, which is a town in the Shenandoah Valley, and that was it for Sigel. He retreated northward, and he's out of the campaign too. So, so nobody's going to hold a leg. Grant's going to have to do the skinning without anybody helping him.
All right. Well, here is where we see Grant move south. And before we get into this, I just want to mention kind of as a meta comment that we're going to see Grant and Lee face off here. It's an interesting chess match. And of course, Grant has the advantage. But both of them are really formidable generals in their own right, of course. And we haven't seen that many times in the Civil War where you have two competent generals facing off, where you have two clear strengths. And Grant's strength, he has complete and total adherence to the vision and his objective of neutralizing Lee's army, his part of the 5-point plan. And Lee's strengths is that his men are fiercely devoted to him, even after debacles like Gettysburg and other places. And he makes mistakes, of course. He misreads Grant. Sometimes he can place his small army in danger when he's too aggressive, but then at the same time, he can devise a creative solution to turn the tables on his more difficult situation. So both generals, they favor offensive operations. Both are willing to take risks. Both had handicaps. Lee, I would say, had many more. They both had subordinates that sometimes couldn't get the job done or execute the orders the way they wanted. So you can argue all day long about whether or not they're evenly matched, but there's no overwhelming superiority of tactical brilliance on one side or another. So anyway, shall we move south?
Let's do it. Let's march south with General Grant and the Union Army. Okay, so with Grant in command, Grant, of course, had been a winner. He'd won pretty much every battle or campaign that he'd been in charge of out west. And the people of the North, of course, knew this, and their expectations were high. The Southern expectations were also high. You know, Gettysburg, even though, as you mentioned, it was a debacle for the Confederate Army, the Southerners didn't really think after that, oh, man, woe is us, we're going to lose now. Far from it. They were still very confident. They had their hero, General Lee, in command, and they really thought, again, they're on the defensive. They've got the advantage in that regard. They had repulsed, or Lee and the Army of the Northern Virginia had repulsed attack after attack after attack. So There was no reason to think that this would be any different, even though you had Grant. Now, Grant had three objectives. First, his job was to tie Lee down, and he told General Meade, and I need to mention in passing here that General Meade, who was appointed to the command of the Army of the Potomac before Gettysburg, just a few days before, and he had been the Union commander at Gettysburg, victorious. Meade is still in command of the Army of the Potomac, so he's technically in charge, but of course Grant is the one that's really calling the shots. Meade, it's not an independent command for Meade. He does whatever Grant tells him because Grant makes his headquarters in the field to make communications much easier. So Grant tells Meade, wherever Lee goes, you will go also. And in addition to tying Lee down, he's going to bleed Lee's army as much as possible. And then the third objective, and only third, this is the least important of the three, and that is to take Richmond. General Grant agreed with President Lincoln that the army is the objective, not a city or anything else. You got to take out Lee's army. No matter what cities you control, as long as you have this great big army under Lee's command running around, you're never safe. Now, Lee's goal, in fact, this is all he could hope for, was to block Grant and to hold off as long as possible until the Northern will to fight was exhausted. Lee's army was much smaller than Grant's, and it was operating on very low rations, but it had pretty high morale in spite of that. And as we mentioned before, back in our episode on the election of when we talked about the election of 1864, we talked about how Lee and the entire Confederate leadership and everybody in the Confederacy was desperately hoping that a Democrat would win the presidential election in the North in 1864 and would bring the war to an end. So they're just trying to hold out until the election, just to not have any major disasters, major losses. At this point, we're doing this topically. We looked at the West last time, and now we're looking at the East. So we're back in time a little bit from where we left off after our episode in the March to the Sea. So we're in the summer of 1864. Atlanta has not fallen yet. So again, the South thinks we've still got a pretty good chance. Now, when Grant comes down to face off against Lee, he's got about 120,000 men. And Lee only has about 60,000. So that's a 2-to-1 advantage, and Grant is going to milk that for all it's worth. Grant orders his army to march toward Lee. On May 4th, the Union Army crossed the Rapidan River, another one of those east-west rivers we talked about before. Grant is trying to flank, another one of these flanking movements that we've seen so many times. He's trying to get around the Confederate right flank. And again, let's spell out the mental map. It's the same basic mental map that we've had in all of our battles that have occurred in Virginia. So the two armies are spread out roughly east to west, not exactly, but they're more diagonal. But just think about Grant's army is at the top of the map. So Grant's right, or the Union right, is actually the left side of our map. And because he's coming south, he's upside down, if you will. But Lee's army, his right is the right of the map. It's the further to the east, and Lee's left is further to the west on the left side of our map. So hopefully that makes it pretty clear what's going on.
Right. And here where Grant's trying to get around the Confederate flank, and it's important for Lee to defend the river because Lee doesn't want to be forced, especially back to Richmond, because if he is, then the war in the East becomes a siege of Richmond, and sieges don't work well. We saw what happened at Vicksburg. We saw what happened if they're dug in. So if they have the freedom of mobility, then, as you mentioned, the strategy can work to drag this out longer. But if they're forced back, then things can fall apart quickly.
Yeah, Lee is hoping to rely on the things that he's always relied on: surprise, using the terrain to his advantage, hopefully catching pieces of the Union Army separated from other pieces. That had worked very well for him in the past. So hopefully, for Lee at least, that's what's going to happen. We'll see if it actually happens.
Okay, so take us to the wilderness.
All right, so we're going to have a series of battles here, and the first is the Battle of the Wilderness. Grant's army camps at the old Chancellorsville battlefield. We talked about Chancellorsville. It seems like a million years ago, Scott. 1863. It was only 1 year ago in Civil War time. This is the battle where it was Lee's masterpiece. It was the one where Lee had split his army twice and completely rattled Joe Hooker and defeated